The early morning sun painted golden streaks across the airport terminal's windows as First Lieutenant Michelle Thompson adjusted her pristine military uniform. After 6 months of deployment, she was finally heading home to surprise her grandmother for her 80th birthday. The weight of her combat boots against the polished floor created a steady rhythm as she walked through the bustling terminal, her service medals catching the light. As a decorated Army intelligence officer with 2 tours of duty under her belt, Michelle had earned her first-class ticket through her frequent flyer miles. She'd been saving them specifically for this special trip. The excitement of seeing her grandmother's face made every step lighter, despite her exhaustion from the long journey. At Gate C4, the boarding process was already underway. Michelle stood patiently in the priority boarding line, ticket in hand, when she noticed an older gentleman in an expensive suit giving her repeated sideways glances. She'd grown accustomed to such looks over her 12 years of service but maintained her professional composure, focusing instead on the happy reunion ahead. First-class passengers may now begin boarding, announced the gate agent with a warm smile. Michelle stepped forward, presenting her ticket. The older gentleman suddenly pushed past her, bumping her shoulder. "Excuse me," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "but I believe you're in the wrong line. First class is for premium passengers." His eyes deliberately avoided looking at her uniform, instead focusing on her face with an expression of barely concealed disdain. The gate agent's smile faltered as she witnessed the interaction. Other passengers nearby fell silent, the comfortable airport murmur giving way to an uncomfortable tension. Michelle took a deep breath, remembering her grandmother's words about facing ignorance with grace. A young boy in the regular boarding line tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing at Michelle's medals. "Mom, look! She's a hero," he whispered loudly, making several nearby passengers smile. The boy's innocent observation hung in the air, a stark contrast to the gentleman's behavior. Michelle straightened her shoulders, her voice clear and steady as she addressed the man. "Sir, I have a valid first-class ticket, earned through my military service miles. But this isn't about seating arrangements, is it?" She held his gaze, her dignity unwavering. Other passengers began to murmur, many shaking their heads at the gentleman's behavior. An elderly veteran in a Korean War cap stood up from his wheelchair near the gate. "Young lady," he called out, his voice carrying years of wisdom, "some folks never learned that honor isn't about what seat you sit in, but the heart you serve with." The gate agent, recovering her professional demeanor, stepped in. "Sir," she addressed the gentleman firmly, "First Lieutenant Thompson's ticket is indeed for first class. And as a reminder to all our passengers, we're proud to serve our military members and thank them for their service." The gentleman's face reddened, but before he could respond, another first-class passenger, a middle-aged woman in business attire, spoke up. "I'd be honored to trade seats with this gentleman," she announced clearly. "I believe he might be more comfortable in economy, where he can reflect on the meaning of service and respect." A quiet ripple of approval moved through the waiting passengers. Michelle remained composed, though her heart swelled with gratitude for the unexpected support. The gentleman, now faced with the unified response of his fellow travelers, muttered something under his breath and moved to the side, his earlier bravado deflating. As Michelle finally boarded the plane, several passengers nodded respectfully or whispered thanks for her service. The incident, though unpleasant, had revealed something beautiful, the way ordinary people could stand together against injustice, how a child's innocent observation could cut through prejudice, and how dignity could triumph over discrimination. Settling into her first-class seat, Michelle pulled out her phone and looked at the photo of her grandmother, remembering how she'd taught her to face hatred with strength and grace. The day's events had proven that while darkness existed in the world, light always found its way through, often through the actions of everyday heroes in waiting rooms and airport terminals, standing up for what's right. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Michelle noticed the businesswoman who had spoken up earlier catching her eye from across the aisle. With a warm smile, she introduced herself as Dr. Chen, a psychology professor returning from a conference. "I hope you don't mind," she said softly, "but I'd like to share something with you." Dr. Chen explained how her father, also a veteran, had faced similar discrimination decades ago after returning from Vietnam. "He never got to see how things changed," she said, her voice carrying a hint of both sadness and hope. "But watching you today, standing tall with such grace, it would have made him proud." The flight attendant, who had overheard the conversation, paused her service cart. "My crew and I want you to know that we've noted the earlier incident in our report," she informed Michelle quietly. "Our airline has a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior." Her professional demeanor carried an undertone of protective fierce. Meanwhile, in economy class, the story of what had transpired at the gate was spreading in hushed conversations. The young boy who had called Michelle a hero was now eagerly telling his seatmate about all the medals he'd spotted on her uniform. His mother, a high school teacher, was already planning how to incorporate this real-life lesson about standing up to prejudice into her next class discussion. The Korean War veteran, settled in his seat with help from his caregiver, pulled out a worn photograph from his wallet. It showed him standing proudly with his integrated unit in 1953. "Times change," he mused to his seatmate, "but courage always looks the same." As the flight progressed, Michelle found herself deep in conversation with Dr. Chen about the evolution of social justice and the role of everyday citizens in creating change. The professor shared stories from her research about how small acts of solidarity, like those displayed at the gate, could create ripple effects through communities. "You know," Dr. Chen observed thoughtfully, "what happened today wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about every person who witnessed it being forced to choose, stay silent or stand up. And they chose to stand up." The conversation was interrupted by turbulence, causing the seatbelt signs to illuminate. As passengers gripped their armrests, Michelle instinctively began calming those around her, her training kicking in. Her steady presence and reassuring words helped ease the tension, demonstrating yet another dimension of her service to others. During the brief rough patch, the gentleman from earlier was visibly shaken in his economy seat. Michelle noticed him watching as she helped an elderly passenger secure her oxygen mask, her action speaking louder than any words could about the true meaning of first-class behavior. After the turbulence passed, a flight attendant brought Michelle a note. It was from a teenage girl seated a few rows behind her in economy. The carefully folded paper read, "I'm in JROTC, and I want to be just like you someday. Thank you for showing me what strength really looks like." Michelle carefully tucked the note into her uniform pocket, next to her grandmother's photo. She thought about how her grandmother had always taught her that true change happens in small moments, in everyday choices to stand up for what's right. As they began their descent, Dr. Chen shared one final observation. "You know what struck me most about the incident?" she said. "It wasn't just that people stood up against something wrong, it was that they stood up for something right. They weren't just rejecting hatred, they were embracing dignity." The plane touched down smoothly, and as passengers prepared to disembark, something unexpected happened. The Korean War veteran's caregiver had spread the word, and as Michelle stood to retrieve her overhead bag, the entire economy cabin began to applaud. It wasn't just for her, she realized, but for every person who had chosen to be on the right side of that moment at the gate. The gentleman who had caused the initial confrontation sat silently, his earlier arrogance replaced by what appeared to be genuine reflection. As he caught Michelle's eye, she gave him a small, professional nod. Her grandmother had also taught her that growth was always possible, and sometimes the seeds of change needed time to take root. Walking through the terminal toward baggage claim, Michelle was stopped by various passengers who wanted to shake her hand or share their own stories. The young boy who had called her a hero gave her a crayon drawing he'd made during the flight, featuring a stick figure in uniform with a cape. At baggage claim, Michelle noticed a local news reporter interviewing some passengers about what had happened on the flight. The story was already spreading, but her focus remained on her upcoming reunion with her grandmother. As she waited for her bags, the young boy's mother approached her again, this time with tears in her eyes. "I need to tell you something," she said, introducing herself as Mrs. Baker. "I teach at Central High School, and just last week, one of my students, a bright young girl wearing a hijab, faced discrimination in our cafeteria. I didn't speak up immediately, and that moment has haunted me. But today, watching you and everyone at the gate, it showed me what courage looks like." The Korean War veteran, now waiting for his wheelchair assistance, overheard their conversation. "Back in my day," he called over, "we learned that silence only serves the wrong side of history. Every time someone stands up, it makes it easier for the next person to do the same." As they talked, Michelle's bags appeared on the carousel. A group of young soldiers who had been in economy class rushed forward to help her with her luggage, their respect evident in their crisp salutes and earnest faces. Among them was a young private who shared that her own grandmother had been one of the first black nurses in their local VA hospital. "Ma'am," the private said, her voice filled with emotion, "my grandmother always said that change doesn't come from grand gestures, but from small moments of unshakable dignity. Today proved her right." The gentleman from the flight was still lingering near the baggage claim, noticeably affected by the continuing ripples of the morning's events. His demeanor had shifted dramatically from his earlier arrogance. Finally, he approached Michelle, his expensive shoes scuffing slightly on the airport floor. "First Lieutenant," he began, his voice heavy with regret, "I owe you an apology. My behavior was inexcusable. My granddaughter is actually in the Air Force, and if someone treated her the way I treated you..." He trailed off, emotion catching in his throat. "I've been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself today." Michelle listened with the same dignity she'd shown earlier. "Sir," she responded carefully, "growth often begins with discomfort. Thank you for having the courage to acknowledge that." Her words carried no bitterness, only the wisdom her grandmother had instilled in her about the importance of allowing people room to change. As this exchange concluded, Dr. Chen approached with an unexpected proposal. "First Lieutenant Thompson, I'd like to invite you to speak at our university's upcoming symposium on moral courage in modern America. Today's events have illuminated something crucial about how social change happens in real time." The news reporter, who had been discreetly observing these interactions, finally approached Michelle. "Ma'am, would you be willing to share your perspective on today's events? So many passengers have spoken about how your response to discrimination became a teaching moment about dignity and respect." Michelle politely declined the immediate interview, explaining that she was on her way to surprise her grandmother. However, she offered to speak with them later, understanding that sharing such stories could help others find their own courage to stand up against injustice. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the airport, Mrs. Baker's son, the same boy who had first called her a hero, ran up with one final question. "Did you learn to be brave in the army?" he asked innocently. Michelle knelt down to his level, smiling warmly. "I learned bravery from my grandmother," she explained. "She taught me that true courage isn't about being fearless, it's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. The army just gave me more opportunities to practice what she taught me." The boy nodded solemnly, clutching his mother's hand. Around them, other passengers were sharing contact information, inspired to stay connected after their shared experience. The Korean War veteran was exchanging details with Dr. Chen, who wanted to record his stories for her research on social progress. As Michelle finally headed toward the exit, she overheard snippets of conversations that showed how the morning's events had touched different people in different ways. Some discussed starting anti-discrimination programs in their workplaces. Others shared personal stories of times they wished they'd spoken up. The gentleman who had apologized was deep in conversation with the young private about his granddaughter's experiences in the Air Force. Stepping out into the bright midday sun, Michelle checked her phone for her rideshare details. Her grandmother's surprise party was in 3 hours, and this unexpected morning had added another layer of meaning to their reunion. She thought about how proud her grandmother would be, not just of her military service, but of how she'd handled this situation with the same grace and dignity she'd been taught from childhood. In the rideshare heading to her grandmother's house, Michelle watched the familiar neighborhoods of her childhood roll past the window. Her driver, a woman in her mid-50s named Rose, had immediately noticed her uniform and shared that her own daughter was serving in the Navy. "You know," Rose said, glancing at Michelle in the rearview mirror, "I just dropped off another passenger at the airport who was telling me about something remarkable that happened this morning. A soldier who handled a difficult situation with incredible grace." Her eyes widened with recognition. "Wait, was that you?" Michelle smiled softly, nodding. Rose shook her head in amazement. "My daughter faces challenges too, being a woman in the military. It's stories like yours that give me hope. Would you mind if I share this with her?" As they drove, Michelle's phone buzzed with notifications. The airport incident had started trending on local social media. Someone had recorded part of the interaction and posted it online, praising the unity of the passengers and the dignity of her response. While Michelle had never sought attention, she understood that sometimes personal moments became public teachings. The rideshare passed her old high school, triggering memories of her grandmother attending every track meet, every award ceremony, always sitting in the front row with unwavering pride. Even when Michelle faced discrimination as the only black female captain of the track team, her grandmother had taught her to run her race with grace, letting her achievements speak louder than any prejudice. Rose turned down the familiar oak-lined street where Michelle had grown up. "My daughter tells me that change in the military is slow," she said, "but it's people like you who make it happen, one day at a time." As they approached the house, Michelle noticed several cars parked nearby. Her family had planned the surprise party well. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Dr. Chen. "Your grandmother's lessons in dignity didn't just shape you. Today they taught an entire plane full of people about courage." Rose pulled up to the curb, but before Michelle could reach for her wallet, the driver shook her head. "This one's on me, Lieutenant. Would you mind taking a quick photo with me to send to my daughter?" After taking the photo, Michelle gathered her bags and took a deep breath, looking at the house where she'd learned her most important lessons about strength and dignity. The porch swing where her grandmother had sat with her after her first experience with racism in second grade still swayed gently in the breeze. She remembered her grandmother's words that day, "Baby, they can only take your dignity if you give it to them." As she approached the house, memories flooded back, learning to bake cookies in the kitchen while her grandmother shared stories of the civil rights movement, doing homework at the dining room table as her grandmother graded papers from her 30 years of teaching, sitting on the porch swing discussing Michelle's decision to join the military. The Korean War veteran's words from the airport echoed in her mind, "Times change, but courage always looks the same." Her grandmother had been proving that truth for decades, first as one of the few black teachers in their district during integration, then as a mentor to countless students who needed someone to believe in them. Michelle checked her uniform one last time. Her grandmother had always emphasized the importance of presentation, not for others' approval, but as a reflection of self-respect. The medals that had caught the morning sun at the airport now gleamed in the afternoon light, each one representing not just military achievement, but the values her grandmother had instilled. Through the window, she could see movement, shadows of her family members trying to be discreet as they prepared for her arrival. Her cousin's car was poorly hidden around the corner, and balloons peeked out from behind the curtains. The sight brought tears to her eyes, thinking of how her grandmother deserved every bit of celebration and more. The morning's events at the airport had reminded Michelle of another of her grandmother's favorite sayings, "When they go low, you go high, not because they deserve your grace, but because you deserve to keep your peace." Those words had guided her through military training, through deployments, and through that morning's confrontation. As she stepped onto the porch, Michelle's phone buzzed one final time. It was a message from Mrs. Baker, the teacher from the airport. "My students were captivated by your story. They said it helped them understand what dignity in the face of discrimination really means." Thank you for showing them that heroes don't just exist in history books. Michelle smiled, thinking about how her grandmother had been teaching that same lesson for over half a century. Today's airport incident wasn't just about a first-class seat, it was about the first-class values that her grandmother had woven into the fabric of her character. The porch creaked slightly under her boots, the same sound she'd heard thousands of times before. She could smell her grandmother's famous peach cobbler through the screen door. Some things never changed. Her hand reached for the doorbell, trembling slightly with emotion. The morning's events had been unexpected, but they'd made this homecoming even more meaningful. Just before pressing the bell, Michelle straightened her shoulders one final time, embodying the poise and strength her grandmother had taught her. Behind this door was the woman who had shown her that true dignity wasn't about where you sat, but how you carried yourself through life's turbulent flights. The doorbell chimed through the house, its familiar tone triggering a flurry of hushed whispers and hurried footsteps inside. Michelle's heart raced as she heard her grandmother's voice, still strong and clear at 80, "Now who could that be on my special day?" The door opened, and there stood Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, elegant in her favorite blue dress, her silver hair styled perfectly as always. For a moment, time stood still as grandmother and granddaughter locked eyes. Then Eleanor's hands flew to her face, tears welling up instantly. "My baby girl," she exclaimed, pulling Michelle into an embrace that carried the weight of 6 months' separation. "You weren't supposed to be here until next week." The gathered family members burst out from their hiding places, cameras flashing to capture the moment, but Michelle and Eleanor remained lost in their embrace. "Happy birthday, Grandma," Michelle whispered, her own tears falling freely now. Eleanor pulled back slightly, holding her granddaughter at arm's length to take in her uniform, her medals, her bearing. Pride radiated from her face like sunlight. "Look at you," Eleanor breathed, touching Michelle's medals gently. "Every bit the soldier, but more importantly, every bit the woman we raised you to be." The family gathered around them, adding their own hugs and greetings, but Eleanor kept one arm firmly around her granddaughter's waist. As they moved into the living room, where birthday decorations brightened every corner, Michelle's aunt brought out a laptop. "Mom, you need to see this," she said excitedly. "Michelle's already making waves here at home." The video from the airport had gained significant attention, with comments pouring in from people touched by the display of unity and dignity. Eleanor watched the video intently, her expression shifting between concern, pride, and knowing wisdom. When it finished, she looked at her granddaughter with eyes that had seen decades of similar struggles. "You handled that exactly right," she said firmly. "Just like we discussed on this very couch all those years ago." Michelle's younger cousins gathered closer as Eleanor continued, "You see, children, what your cousin did today wasn't just about standing up for herself. It was about showing others how to stand up for what's right." Her voice carried the weight of experience, of lessons learned during the civil rights movement and passed down through generations. The house filled with the aroma of soul food. Eleanor's legendary cooking had drawn family from 3 states for her birthday. As everyone moved to the dining room, Michelle noticed her grandmother's proud collection of family photos on the wall, including her own military graduation picture prominently displayed. Over plates of perfectly seasoned food, Eleanor shared stories with the younger generation about her years as a teacher during integration. "You know," she said, passing the cornbread, "what happened at that airport today reminds me of my first day teaching at Central High. Sometimes, it's not about changing everyone's mind at once, it's about showing them a better way to be." Michelle's phone buzzed again. Dr. Chen had sent a follow-up message about the university symposium. Eleanor read it and smiled. "You should do it," she said firmly. "Every story of dignity shared is a seed planted for future change." As the afternoon progressed, more family members arrived, each bringing new dishes and new stories. Michelle's young second cousin sat at her feet, asking about her medals and her travels. She noticed how they looked at her with the same admiration she'd seen in the young boy's eyes at the airport. Eleanor's church friends arrived, bringing with them news that the airport story had reached their community. Our youth group was particularly moved, shared the pastor's wife. They're asking if Michelle would speak to them about maintaining dignity in difficult situations. Looking around the room full of loved ones, Michelle saw the legacy of strength her grandmother had built: doctors, teachers, business owners, and community leaders, each carrying forward the lessons of dignity and perseverance that Eleanor had instilled. Later, as the party moved to the back porch for cake, Eleanor pulled Michelle aside. "Baby," she said softly, "I want you to know something. That man at the airport? His ignorance didn't just meet your strength, it met the strength of every person in our family who ever faced down hatred with dignity. It met your grandfather's strength when he integrated his workplace. It met my strength when I taught through those difficult early years. And most importantly, it met the strength of every person who chose to stand with you." The setting sun cast long shadows across the porch as Eleanor addressed her gathered family. "Today, we're not just celebrating my 80 years, she announced. "We're celebrating what those years have produced, children and grandchildren who carry our values forward, who face the world with dignity, and who inspire others to do the same." Michelle watched her grandmother blow out the candles on her birthday cake, the warm light reflecting in her eyes. In that moment, she understood that her morning at the airport hadn't just been about a seat on a plane, it had been about the culmination of generations of lessons in dignity, strength, and grace. As evening settled over the neighborhood, most of the party guests had departed, leaving behind birthday cards, warm wishes, and containers of leftover food. Michelle and Eleanor sat together on the familiar porch swing, the same spot where they'd shared countless conversations over the years. The gentle creaking of the chains provided a rhythm to their thoughts. "You know," Eleanor began, sipping her chamomile tea, "watching that airport video reminded me of something your grandfather used to say. He'd tell me, Eleanor, change doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it comes in quiet moments when people choose to do the right thing." Michelle adjusted the cushion behind her grandmother's back, a small gesture of care. The Korean War veteran at the airport said something similar. He talked about how courage always looks the same, even as times change. Eleanor's eyes lit up with recognition. "Isn't that the truth? When I started teaching in '63, I had a student, a little white girl, who shared her lunch with me when some of the other teachers wouldn't eat in the same room. That small act of kindness meant everything. Just like those passengers today, she chose to stand on the right side of history." Inside the house, Michelle's aunt was packaging leftovers in the kitchen, humming one of the gospel songs they'd sung during the party. The sound drifted through the screen door, mixing with the evening chorus of crickets. "Your story's already making a difference," Eleanor continued, showing Michelle her phone. The local news had picked up the airport incident, focusing not on the confrontation but on the unity of the passengers who stood together. Comments were pouring in from people sharing their own experiences and commitments to speaking up against injustice. A notification popped up: the young boy's mother, Mrs. Baker, had started a social media campaign called #DignityInAction, sharing stories of people standing up against discrimination in their daily lives. She'd credited Michelle's example as the inspiration. "Look at these ripples you've created," Eleanor mused, scrolling through the responses. "But you know what makes me proudest? Not that you stood your ground, but how you did it. You gave that man room to learn and grow, just like we talked about all those years ago." Michelle leaned her head on her grandmother's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume, the same one she'd worn for decades. "I remembered what you taught me about dignity being a choice we make every day, especially when it's hard." A car slowed down in front of the house, and they recognized Dr. Chen from the airport. She'd brought a birthday card for Eleanor after learning about the celebration. "I hope you don't mind," she said, climbing the porch steps, "but I wanted to thank the woman who taught Michelle the lessons that touched so many lives today." Eleanor welcomed her warmly, making room on the porch swing. Dr. Chen shared how the story had resonated with her university students, who'd seen it on social media. "They're using it as a case study in my social psychology class," she explained. "It's showing them how individual actions can create collective change." As they talked, more messages arrived from the airport passengers. The gentleman who had apologized had written a lengthy reflection about his own journey of recognition and change. The young private had shared the story with her unit, sparking important discussions about leadership and dignity. "You see," Eleanor said, her voice carrying years of wisdom, "sometimes the biggest changes start in the smallest moments. When I was teaching, I had a principal who wouldn't look me in the eye for my first year. But I kept showing up, doing my job with excellence, treating him with the respect he hadn't yet learned to return. By my second year, he was recommending me for head of department." The streetlights flickered on, casting a warm glow over the porch. Michelle's aunt joined them, bringing fresh cups of tea and her grandmother's favorite peach cobbler. "Mom," she said, "tell them about the time you integrated the teacher's lunchroom." Eleanor laughed softly. "Oh, that wasn't just me. It was every teacher who chose to sit with me, one by one, until segregation became impossible to maintain. Just like today, it wasn't just Michelle's response that made the difference. It was every passenger who chose to stand with her." As the night deepened, they shared more stories: Eleanor's experiences during the civil rights movement, Michelle's challenges and triumphs in the military, Dr. Chen's research on social change. Each story wove together, creating a tapestry of progress made and progress still needed. "The beautiful thing about dignity," Eleanor reflected, "is that it's contagious. When one person stands tall, it gives others permission to do the same. That's what I see in this #Dignity in Action movement, people remembering their own power to make a difference." Michelle showed them the note from the JROTC student at the airport, and Eleanor's eyes welled up with tears. "This is how change sustains itself," she said. "Each generation teaching the next, showing them what courage looks like in everyday moments." A gentle breeze carried the scent of Eleanor's prized roses from the garden. "You know what this birthday taught me," she said, looking at her granddaughter with infinite love. "That the seeds we plant, the lessons about dignity, courage, and grace, they keep growing long after we've moved on. Today wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about showing the world that change is still possible, one heart at a time." The next morning, sunlight streamed through Eleanor's kitchen windows as she taught Michelle her secret recipe for sweet potato pie. The kitchen radio hummed quietly in the background until a familiar story caught their attention. The local news was covering yesterday's airport incident, but with an unexpected twist. In a remarkable turn of events, the announcer said, "What began as a confrontation at our local airport has sparked a nationwide conversation about dignity and unity. The #Dignity in Action has gone viral, with thousands sharing their own stories of standing up against discrimination." Eleanor's hands paused in the pie crust preparation. "Listen to that," she said softly, flour dusting her apron. "Your grandfather would say this is how change happens, kitchen by kitchen, story by story." Michelle's phone buzzed with a message from the airline. They were implementing a new training program inspired by yesterday's events, focusing on how their staff and passengers could better support diversity and inclusion. They wanted both Michelle and the Korean War veteran to consult on the program. "Now that's what I call turning lemons into lemonade," Eleanor chuckled, returning to her pie crust. "But remember, baby, it's not about the recognition. It's about the change it creates." As they worked together in the kitchen, visitors began arriving, neighbors who'd heard the story and wanted to share their own experiences. Mrs. Washington from next door brought her granddaughter, a shy teenager who dreamed of joining the Air Force. "Would you mind talking with her?" she asked Michelle. "She's been dealing with some doubts about pursuing her dreams." The morning turned into an impromptu gathering, with Eleanor's kitchen becoming a space for sharing stories and wisdom. The teenager, inspired by Michelle's story, spoke about the discrimination she'd faced in her STEM classes. Other neighbors shared their own experiences of standing up against injustice. Dr. Chen called to share exciting news. Her university wanted to establish a scholarship in Eleanor's name, recognizing lifetime achievement in teaching dignity through action. Your grandmother's lessons didn't just shape you, she told Michelle. Through you, they're shaping a new generation. The local high school principal called next, asking if Michelle would consider speaking at their upcoming assembly. Our students need to hear about dignity from someone who's lived it, he explained. Especially now, when social media makes it so easy to forget our humanity. Eleanor listened to these calls with quiet pride, continuing to work on her pies. You know, she said between crimping edges, this reminds me of the summer of '64, when my teaching methods became a topic of discussion. I wasn't trying to make headlines, I was just treating every child with the dignity they deserved. Around noon, Rose, the rideshare driver from yesterday, stopped by. Her daughter, the Navy service woman, had seen the viral video and immediately recognized Michelle's story. She asked me to deliver this, Rose said, holding out a letter. It was a handwritten note of gratitude, sharing how the story had given her unit the courage to address ongoing discrimination issues. The Korean War veteran also visited, accompanied by his granddaughter. He'd brought photographs from his service days, sharing stories of how his integrated unit had maintained dignity despite the prejudices of the time. The uniform doesn't know color, he said, showing the photos to the teenager interested in the Air Force. It only knows courage and character. As the afternoon progressed, Eleanor's kitchen became a kind of living classroom. Young and old gathered around her table, sharing experiences and learning from each other. Michelle noticed how her grandmother naturally facilitated these conversations, just as she had done for decades in her classroom. The gentleman from the airport had made headlines of his own, publishing an open letter in the local newspaper about his experience. Yesterday taught me that change is possible at any age, he wrote. It took a first lieutenant's dignity to help me see my own lack of it. Mrs. Baker called to share how her students had responded to the story. They'd started a dignity club at school, committed to standing up against bullying and discrimination. Your grandmother's teachings didn't just stay in your family, she told Michelle. They're spreading through our whole community. Eleanor's pies filled the kitchen with their sweet aroma as she shared her own perspective on the growing movement. Change isn't always about grand gestures, she said, writing down her recipe for the gathered neighbors. Sometimes it's about passing down recipes for dignity, teaching others how to rise above hatred while keeping their souls sweet. The local newspaper's editor called, requesting to feature Eleanor in a special piece about generational wisdom and social progress. Your family's story shows us that dignity isn't just inherited, she explained. It's taught, learned, and passed forward. As evening approached again, Michelle sat with her grandmother at the kitchen table, surrounded by cooling pies and lingering neighbors. The #DignityInAction hashtag had reached millions, with people worldwide sharing their commitments to standing up against discrimination in their daily lives. Look at all this, Eleanor said, gesturing to her kitchen full of people sharing stories and hope. This is how real change happens, not just through grand speeches or viral videos, but through everyday people sitting together, sharing their truths, and choosing dignity over division. 1 week after Eleanor's birthday celebration, the community center's main hall was filled to capacity. People from all walks of life had gathered for what had been dubbed a celebration of dignity, an event that grew organically from the airport incident and its rippling effects through the community. Eleanor sat in the front row, radiant in her Sunday best, watching Michelle address the diverse crowd. The first lieutenant stood tall in her uniform, her medals catching the light just as they had that morning at the airport. What happened that day wasn't just about a seat on a plane, Michelle began, her voice carrying the same quiet strength she'd learned from her grandmother. It was about the choice we all face when confronted with injustice, to remain silent or to stand for dignity. In the audience, familiar faces from the airport incident sat alongside community members. The Korean War veteran and his granddaughter, Mrs. Baker, and her son, Dr. Chen, with her university students, and even the gentleman from first class, who had become an unexpected advocate for change. My grandmother taught me that dignity isn't just a word, it's an action, Michelle continued, glancing at Eleanor. It's the choice we make every day to treat others with respect, even when they don't offer the same in return. It's the courage to stand tall, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us. The hashtag Dignity in Action movement had transformed from a hashtag into a genuine community initiative. Local businesses had adopted new training programs, schools had incorporated dignity-based curriculum, and people were sharing their own stories of standing up against discrimination. Rose, the rideshare driver, shared how her daughter's naval unit had implemented new inclusion protocols inspired by the airport incident. Mrs. Baker's high school students presented their Dignity Club initiatives, which had already spread to neighboring schools. The gentleman from the airport spoke about his journey of recognition and change, drawing tears from many in the audience. Change doesn't always announce itself with fanfare, Michelle explained, echoing her grandmother's wisdom. Sometimes it comes in quiet moments, in a child speaking up against bullying, in a colleague supporting a marginalized coworker, in strangers uniting to stand for what's right. Dr. Chen presented her research on how small acts of solidarity could create lasting social change, using the airport incident as a case study. The airline representative announced their new Dignity in Flight program, aimed at promoting respectful and inclusive travel experiences for all passengers. But the most powerful moment came when Eleanor took the stage. The 80-year-old educator walked with the same grace she'd shown throughout her teaching career, carrying decades of wisdom in her gentle smile. When I began teaching in 1963, she said, her voice strong and clear, I couldn't have imagined a day like this. Not because I didn't believe in change, but because I understood that real change happens heart by heart, moment by moment. She shared stories from her teaching days, drawing parallels between past struggles and present challenges. What my granddaughter experienced at the airport is not new, she explained. What is new is how people responded, not with silence, but with solidarity. Not with acceptance, but with action. The young teenager who dreamed of joining the Air Force stepped forward to share how the story had affected her. Before this, I worried that my dreams were too big, she admitted. But now I understand that dignity isn't about waiting for others to make space for you. It's about carrying yourself with such grace that they recognize the space was always yours to begin with. As the event drew to a close, community members came forward one by one, making public commitments to carrying the message of dignity forward in their own spheres of influence. Business owners pledged to create more inclusive workplaces. Teachers promised to foster environments of respect and understanding. Students committed to standing up against bullying and discrimination. Michelle joined her grandmother on stage for the final moments. Together, they represented two generations of strength, wisdom, and unwavering dignity. The sight of them standing side by side, the elderly teacher who had fought for integration and the decorated soldier who continued her legacy, moved many to tears. The story that began at an airport didn't end there, Michelle concluded. It continues in each of us, every time we choose dignity over division, courage over comfort, and unity over indifference. As my grandmother always says, dignity isn't just inherited, it's taught, learned, and passed forward. The evening ended with the announcement of the Eleanor Thompson Dignity Scholarship, which would support students committed to promoting inclusion and respect in their communities. The first recipient would be the young girl who dreamed of joining the Air Force. As people filed out of the community center, sharing hugs and making plans for future initiatives, Eleanor and Michelle stood together, watching the impact of their story continue to unfold. The Korean War veteran's words from the airport rang true. Times had changed, but courage did look the same, generation after generation. You know what makes me proudest? Eleanor said softly to her granddaughter as they walked to the car. Not the scholarship, not the movement, not even the changes we're seeing. What makes me proudest is that you understood the most important lesson of all, that true dignity lifts everyone higher." Michelle smiled, helping her grandmother into the car. Above them, the stars shone bright in the evening sky, witnesses to a story that had begun with a confrontation over a first-class seat but had evolved into something far more meaningful, a reminder that every moment carries the potential for transformation, and that dignity, when chosen consistently, has the power to change not just individuals, but entire communities.